André Hoffmann is here today in his capacity as the president of MAVA Foundation. MAVA Foundation is a foundation that invests in people and nature to conserve biodiversity in the Mediterranean, West Africa, and Switzerland specifically. Mr. André Hoffmann, welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much. Is this working? Can you hear me? Yeah. In the Anglo-Saxon world in general, it is normal to start a couple of remarks with a joke. In Asia, it's normal to start with an apology, especially in Japan. I thought that since we are trying to find a new way of doing things, I would start by apologizing for not having a joke to share with you. And I would like to sort of use this sort of example to demonstrate that we are here drafting something completely new. I'm profoundly humbled by the amount of talent I've seen over the last couple of days. So many of you have demonstrated very exciting initiatives using the strength of Africa to demonstrate a couple of opportunities for us going forward to coming out of the old model. So I thought I would share with you not an experience, but a little bit about my life. I was born far too long ago in a nature reserve. My father was a renowned ornithologist who studied bird migration and who finally settled in the Camargue, which is the delta of the Rhone River. I grew up surrounded by wetlands. My father started there a research institute, and that research institute started by studying birds, in particular flamingos, who are the iconic birds of this part of the world. And it developed quickly into something a little bit more ambitious, understanding that if you want to promote, if you want to conserve a population of birds, you also need to understand the habitat, and if you want to understand the habitat, you need to study it. So the beginning of science-based conservation. By the way, the word conservation is not really good. It's a defensive word, you know. It's a word that you use when you want to hang on to something, which is not what this is about. This is about understanding nature to be able to help it, to be able to develop something dynamic, a relationship between humans and nature. And I'll come back to this later on. So flamingos was a subject of studies, and flamingos stopped nesting in the Camargue. The population of West Mediterranean stopped nesting in the Camargue because of lack of habitat. There was no place for them to nest. So a very simple operation, you know, a bulldozer created an artificial habitat, and they came back. I was about 11 years at the time, and I remember very well that particular moment where suddenly the flamingo nested again. And for me, it was really a demonstration that science can help you to develop certain situations, to develop certain solutions, but also that natural nature is not always up to the challenge that we throw at it. And so it's important for us to be able to understand what's going on so that we can continue to inform it, to continue to inform our relationship with it. The house was always full of scientists who taught us, children from our father, the beauty of understanding before expressing yourself, the sort of search for truth rather than the defense of opinions. And today I can see that that hasn't been spread very widely as a way of thinking, but I hope we will be able to go back to this at some stage. So, born surrounded by nature, but also born in a family that owns one of the largest pharmaceutical business on the planet, and certainly the largest in Europe. My great-grandfather, Fritz Hoffmann, started a company called Hoffmann-La Roche, now the Roche Group Pharmaceuticals. It's a pharmaceutical company active all over the world, which has 95,000 employees, represents the last solution for a lot of people. Last year, 121 million people took our drugs, took drugs that were developed by Roche. We haven't cured everybody, but we cured a lot of them, and I think that's something I'm particularly proud of. And I'm particularly proud of because my family has been the controlling shareholder for the past It was started in 1896, for the past 123 years. So, as you can see, a split personality. I have a day job and I have a night job. My day job is that I represent my family in the ownership of the business, so I'm active on the board of the company. And my other side is that I am involved in conservation. Earlier I called it a night job. I think night job is not the right way to approach it. I mean, it is obviously an important job. I think it's important to realize that nature and the degradation thereof is the biggest challenge confronting us all. If we are in business or if we are in civil society, if we are in politics, we need to be able to compute that the future will require solving the climate and environmental crisis. So the fact that I am able to see the element from the business side and from the conservation side has allowed me to embark onto a number of different initiatives. Today, I am the president of the Foundation MAVA, which was created by my father some years ago, and I am also the vice president of Hoffmann Laroche. When I go to the boardroom in Switzerland, when I arrived in the boardroom 25 years ago, and I said to fellow board members, you know, nature is important, we have to do something about nature, I was told, yes, you're right, it's absolutely important, absolutely important. Let us make money, and once we have made the money, we will give you some for your birds in the Camargue. Which was really not what I had in mind. I mean, I had in mind, you know, how do we construct something, a sort of future where we could have a working together with nature in order to create long-term value. But it was a very strange phenomenon. The company just didn't accept nature as part of their daily life. Nature was in Africa, nature was in the Camargue, nature was far away. It wasn't in the boardroom. It wasn't in the boardroom in Switzerland. And somehow, that thinking still continues. I mean, a lot of the companies I deal with believe of themselves as being autonomous, as being independent from the rest, disconnected from the rest of the planet. And that's clearly something we have to change. I'm proud to say that for Roche, we have included these considerations into the way we do business. And we have now been voted for the 10th consecutive year, the Dow Jones Index Sustainability Champion for the pharmaceutical industry worldwide. 10 years, I think that's quite good. Thank you. I think it's good not only because it's nice to have an accolade, it's nice to hear people clapping, but also because when you win it the first time, it's just an exam. The second time, you're very pleased. The third time, you're ecstatic. 10 years later, it's in the genes. You know, it's actually in the DNA of the company. When we make an investment decision, when we do our asset allocation, when we try to manage risk, we include nature into that process. We need to think long-term because discovering medicine is the long-term process. And we can only do that if we take into account what nature, if we manage the natural risk. And so I think that's quite an important thing. Now, on the other side, if I go back to my activity as a philanthropist, as a conservation, as an investor in nature, as a philanthropist, we'll say, you have to ask yourself the fundamental question: what are we actually doing? MAVA specializes into species conservation and area conservation. So think flamingo, think wetlands in the Camargue, think the tiger, think the Amazon, things like this. And we have to understand that all this, if it is funded by philanthropy, is something that eventually will run out because philanthropic funding, in my view, is not a sustainable option. You need to create opportunities which allow this project to continue on their own. So when I heard that there was a conference somewhere in Kigali which talks about the business of nature, I thought, wow, you know, I've got to be there. So that's why I came. And that's why I think that MAVA as a model is a model that is slowly dying out. I mean, obviously we need philanthropy because the system in which we live is not perfect. But in an ideal situation, We would not need to protect this animal and this species because we would do something at the origin of it. We would try to identify the root causes of the degradation of the environment. Why are we over-consuming natural resources? Why are we eating up the landscape as quickly as possible? Why are we degrading not only the environment but also the social environment? Why are inequalities rising? Why is there more and more of people suffering from inequalities within society? Well, there's a very simple reason. It's the dictatorship of the Anglo-Saxon concept of the maximization of short-term profit. Today, if I take an investment decision, I think about the money I can make. I don't think about the long-term contribution to society. When I say if I mean if us. I mean, this is something that we are all in. So this maximization of short-term profit has been discussed several times, has been discussed by a lot of academicians. I don't know if you remember an economist from the late 50s called Milton Friedman, who wrote the famous semantic work, the business of business is business. In other way, business has to make money. Once we make money, we give it back to society through taxes, through salaries, through dividends. And this money will then allow society to repair the mistakes that have been made in the value creation process. So if I bring it back to a simple example, if I make 100 by cutting a forest, I will give 10 back to an NGO to go and replant the forest afterwards. It's absurd, you agree with me? This is obviously something that as a long-term system has no chance of survival. So for me, it's very important that companies should be engaging with nature as the root cause rather than the root consequence. So the reason we have to protect animals in the wild, we have to protect nature in the sense, is because we are busy destroying it. And so the best way of making a difference into the future vision of the planet is to influence business practices. And I think that is something I would like to do more of. The foundation, MAVA, has already started a whole pillar of work in the new economy, and what we call the green economy. And this is something I would like to continue to do, and I will. Well, and that's one of the reasons why MAVA is going to stop its existence in 2022. I know a number of people here have asked me, why are we not in East Africa? Why do we do work only in West Africa? Well, there are historical reasons for that, but anyway, it's not a problem anymore since we are stopping anyway. So we will not come to East Africa. And I'm just saying that to people who have presented projects. I think it's important, you should know that. So if I want to address the root causes of environmental degradation, we need to talk to business. We need to take this dialogue between business and civil and social society at the highest level. How do we do that? I can see two things. One is that we need to find a better way of measuring success. As long as we measure success just by financial returns, societally we go in the wrong direction. I mean, it has cost the planet in many ways. It has destroyed the planet in many ways, but it has had results. If we look at the Chinese example, 800 million people taken out of poverty over the last 30 years. I mean, without capitalism and without an active market economy, we would not have had that. The problem is the cost, of course. It has had an impact on the rest of the planet, which is barely tolerable, which is in any case not sustainable. And when I just come back from a couple of days in Cape Town for the World Economic Forum on Africa, which I co-chaired, the concept of saying we're going to see in Africa the same sort of economic growth we have seen in parts of Asia in order to lift the majority of the population of Africa out of their hunger zone. I mean, I admire the intentions, but I'm seriously worried about the results. There's an opportunity here to create an African model which will allow for green growth to the benefit of all, and not only to the benefit of Africa, but to the benefit of all us in the planet. I mean, Hassan just showed us a carbon offsetting scheme. That is an opportunity for Africa to help the world to deal with the CO2 emission crisis. So how do we need to measure performance differently? I think the important issue is to bring natural capital onto the balance sheet. We need for companies to be able to realize that when you do business, fresh air and clean water is not necessarily a given. It's not for free. It has a cost. Pollution has a cost. When you pollute something and you don't reimburse the local community, you're actually stealing this from the community. So you need to be able to find a new scorecard for a company's performance. Of course, the finance industry tends to specialize into short-term returns because that's their job. I mean, they have to manage other people's money, and therefore short-term return is the only thing that they can be measured against, unless we change the conditions at which we ask fund managers to manage our money. And that is a process which is already taking place. I don't know if you've read the statement of the American Business Roundtable published by Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan only about a month ago. The purpose of the company is not to make money. The purpose of the company is to serve the community and not only shareholders. The purpose of the company is to satisfy stakeholders. And stakeholders, it's all of us, you know, for big companies. So I think that there is if 180 large American companies publish that sort of statement, it's a sign that things are moving. So I think we can look at it with some hope. But here what you see is, of course, this idea of leadership. And that brings us back to here, to Kigali. If we want to manage this, this movement away from a very simple view of the world, which is short-term profit maximization, we will need to create, not to create, but to help to develop a group of people who have exceptional leadership qualities. And I've engaged myself into a couple of initiatives like this. I have a scheme to promoting scholars in Oxford, at Oxford University. It's called the Weidenfeld-Hoffmann Trust, because I co-created that with a friend of mine called George Weidenfeld, who sadly has left us since. We're trying to facilitate the transfer of knowledge from one of the best universities in the world, Oxford, to difficult geographies where people are usually not capable of, not able to pay for studies there. So we have 120 scholars per year who come and follow the postdoc courses at Oxford. In Cambridge, I created a master in conservation leadership, which is a smaller class. It's only about 40 per year, but which is done in a much more pragmatic way. This is for helping the management of natural spaces in developing countries. And we select the students, and they don't have to pay any tuition. They can come to Cambridge for a year to take that master's. And we now have a cohort of nearly 350 people who have taken that course over the years, creating a community all over Africa, in French-speaking and English-speaking Africa, of people who are actively involved. I have also recently endowed the South African Wildlife College, which is trying to promote the knowledge to run wildlife things. And there we've done a section of this reserved to local communities. So not people who have to go through the education system before coming to usual university abroad, but staying in South Africa in local communities on the border of the Kruger Park. And then, of course, there is the best one, which is the Africa Leadership University. The day I met Fred, I discovered that there were people who had recognized this issue of lack of leadership if you want to move the public agenda. And I think we should all be grateful that Fred has taken this step. This is something which is trailblazing, and I'm really looking forward to be able to continue to connect with the graduates as they go along. A round of applause. What do you think, man? And then lastly, because I think the problem is also global, I've recently initiated an initiative at INSEAD, the business school in Fontainebleau in Paris, where I did my MBA. And the idea is to create an institute, which we have called the Hoffmann Global Institute of Business and Society, to define a new version of management of business. So our ambition is quite simply to change the norm of business education. So no longer a focus on short-term profit maximization only, but also a realization that businesses can be managed for impact, and in particular, taking into account people, planet, and profit. So an environmental, social, and economic return. Obviously, businesses need to be profitable. I'm not advocating for businesses becoming NGOs. That's really not the idea. And I'm not anti-capitalistic either, all the contrary. But we need to understand that companies will only be sustainable if they can measure themselves to the big issues, which are social and environmental, and the biggest of them all, the environment. So this is, I hope, by the way, that the INSEAD Institute can collaborate with ALU on a couple of projects. I think that would be an important thing. Right. To finish, I would like to just give a call to action. The last time I came here was in 1974. It was the year of the IUCN conference, annual conference, of the Great World Conservation Summit in Kinshasa, in Congo. At the time it was Zaire. And we flew from Zaire to Bukavu, and in Bukavu we started mounting into the mountains trying to find the gorillas. We were quite a large expedition. We split into two. I then went back to Europe without having seen the gorilla. My father stayed on and saw them. During that trip, I had the opportunity to meet a lot of exciting young people. People who probably, like me, are now over 60. I mean, people who have sort of a gray hair and more experience than energy, perhaps. And you know what? The conversation today are quite similar. You know, the continent awakening. It is a turning point. Africa is in charge. Africa will be able to do what matters. Africa has an international important activity. Well, frankly, that was half a century ago. Don't you think it's about time that something happened? I'm looking forward to the future, in particular the future of this wonderful continent and of Rwanda in particular. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoffmann. Very, very insightful. Mr. Hoffmann actually brought 16 members of his team to also be here at BCC. So when he says he believes in this and what we're doing, he truly means that. Thank you once again. At this moment, I would like to introduce the man we've been waiting for and are so excited to have in our midst today. I believe he really doesn't need much of an introduction. We've all been talking about the great systems that have been built in this country and all the work that has been done in the conservation space, the beauty of it. I got to experience Kwita Izina this year, and I just got into the depth of what, you know, the conservation space, especially with the gorilla side of things, has done. I still haven't seen a gorilla yet. King Kong has been my best bet, but I hope to see one day. But either way, right now, I'd like to bring up to the stage our Right Honorable Prime Minister, Édouard Ngirente.
Your Excellency Hailemariam, the former Prime Minister of the Federal Republic of Ethiopia, honorable ministers here present, representative of international organizations, CEOs and the head of tourism and conservation organizations, development partners, distinguished guests, good morning and welcome. As we continue to celebrate the conservation achievement in Rwanda, I am pleased to join you today in this 2019 Business of Conservation Conference, representing His Excellency Paul Kagame, the President of the Republic of Rwanda. I would like first to thank the African Leadership University for its active involvement in the delivery of this conference. We were delighted when the African Leadership University opened its second campus in Kigali in September 2017. Distinguished guests, Rwanda is not new to conservation and the protection of natural heritage. We recognize the critical needs for conservation-based tourism and economic development through the protection of our natural ecosystems. We have become a world leader in conservation practices with more than 8.9% of our land base protected as natural parks. A few of our conservation achievements include the following: mountain gorilla conservation in the Virunga Massif. As a result of government, communities, and conservation partners working together, the 2016 census revealed an amazing 59% increase in participation from 2003 when we started the Kwita Izina celebrations. Eastern Bloc Rhino were successfully introduced to Akagera in 2017, 10 years after the last rhino was seen in 2007. African lions were successfully introduced in 2015 after being hunted to extinction in the 90s. An additional 2 male lions were translocated to add to the genetic diversity of population that is now thriving and continues to grow. This is a result of our effort to stop illegal trade, better protection and management of important wetlands, and a strong network of conservation champions. There is also the expansion of Volcanoes National Park by nearly 20 hectares, which was celebrated in January 2018. Rwanda has a strong tourism sector with a tourism strategy that is and will continue to be both pro-conservation and pro-people. It is focused on 2 important areas. One is sustainability through responsible conservation. The second one is tourism and community involvement, which has also been about protecting our natural heritage, providing world-class experiences that profiles the natural and the cultural beauty and diversity of Rwanda. While ensuring that Rwandans benefit from this tourism and conservation, we want to ensure that no Rwandan is left behind. To achieve this goal, the government of Rwanda, together with its partners in the public and the private sector, are implementing strategies around the following broad areas. One is tourism infrastructure to support increased length of stay. The second one is marketing Rwanda to the world. And the third one is improving service delivery and conservation for our environment. These strategies have resulted in a significant result in Rwanda and for Rwandans over the past 15 years. Visits to our national parks increased by 600% since 2003, and 250% growth in revenues from these same visitors. Distinguished guests, this solid foundation of conservation with an aggressive but pro-conservation tourism strategy has resulted in significant positive socio-economic growth and development benefit for our citizens. The government of Rwanda has invested more than $5.8 million since 2005 into more than 647 projects in communities surrounding the national parks. This revenue sharing program, originally 5%, and then increased in 2017 to 10% of all tourism revenues, is about investing in communities living around our national parks, providing economic development capacity and making their lives better for Rwandans. In 2018-2019 alone, the program supported investment worth $1.7 million in 37 projects, an increase of 51% over 2017-2018. This investment has served as a catalyst for our many conservation and community partners. A conservative estimate of community benefit from project investment since 2005 increases to $13 million. The result of this investment is clear to see for both people and nature. We also have an important but little known special guarantee fund in which an additional 5% of all tourism revenues has been used to support the management of compensation resulting from human-wildlife conflict in these same communities surrounding our national parks. In short, our experience in that collaboration and effective partnership are the key to how we have been able to achieve the significant results and the benefit of conservation, sustainable tourism, and economic benefit in Rwanda for Rwandans. They are the means by which Rwanda has achieved the conservation results, providing exceptional tourism experiences for visitors at home and from around the world, and improving the lives of Rwandans. It is also the means by which we achieve additional results. We will achieve additional results in the future. Distinguished guests, in concluding, I would like to thank you for listening to what Rwanda has done. It was mainly focused on the unique approaches and the success related to sound conservation practices to protect our national legacy that support an important sustainable tourism sector in order to ensure economic benefit for Rwandans now and in the future. Allow me to add my voice to calls for action that ensure the protection and the management of our national legacy in Africa, but also make use of it in a sustainable way to help drive economies and the benefits for the people for Africa. Let me conclude by wishing you a productive conference. It is now my pleasure to declare the 2019 Business of Conservation Conference officially open, and I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Honorable Prime Minister. At this point, I'm going to invite Dr. Fred Swanika to the stage to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Sidi. And Honorable Prime Minister, please allow me to thank you again for your remarks. It's incredible to see how the Rwandan government has made conservation a priority, and you can see how it's impacting the economy. Jobs being created, 10% of revenues from conservation going into, directly to the communities and so forth. So I think it's a fantastic role model of how one of the topics that, or one of the ingredients that we've been talking about as necessary for catalyzing conservation in Africa being the enabling environment. So yesterday you recall that we said that for conservation to go from being a sector or an industry that is in decline, that is dying, and to become a growth industry that can actually create jobs and drive economic growth in Africa, we need three things to come together. One is we need an enabling environment with strong political leadership and the right policies. We need talent, and then we need business models that actually make money. And so this morning really has been around this first part. Yesterday we touched on the talent piece a lot in the afternoon, and in the morning we spend a lot of time looking at business models. And so we're now going to go in for the rest of this morning before lunch, really looking at this question of the enabling environment. And so the Prime Minister kicked us off with that. So now I'd like to invite four people to join us for a short panel discussion where we are going to delve a bit more into the politics of the environment. The first person I'd like to invite up is His Excellency Hailemariam Desalegn, the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia. If you can please join us on stage. I'd also then like to invite the Honorable Minister Vincent Biruta, who's the Minister of Environment for Rwanda. And then I'd like to also invite Paulo Gomez. Who is Paulo? Who's the founder and chairman and CEO of Constellar Investment Holdings. And he was also a presidential candidate in his country, Guinea-Bissau. And then finally, Dr. Helen Gichohi, who's an ambassador for conservation in Africa at Fauna and Flora International. Thank you.
Welcome again to all of you to this panel. I'd like to begin first by posing a question to everyone. We've been talking about how nature is one of Africa's greatest assets, one of our unique competitive advantages that no one else has. And this morning we touched on it as well, not just the terrestrial conservation, but we looked at the marine conservation and the blue economy and how that could actually be a huge opportunity for growth. So as we discussed this morning, I'd like us to really think not just about what we're seeing in the terrestrial conservation, but also the opportunities for the blue economy. One of the speakers in the blue economy session this morning reminded us that 70% of the earth is covered with oceans. So that's really where a lot of the potential of the economy also lies. So if this is so important, the first question maybe I'd like to ask every person on the panel to briefly comment on is, why are Africa's, or do you believe that Africa's political leaders are taking this seriously enough? Do you see any examples of good leadership and the strong policies that governments are actually taking in this regard? And so, we'll just perspectives on, and if not, why are they not seeing this potential? So perhaps if we could start with you, Excellency Hailemariam.
First of all, let me take this opportunity to thank you, Fred, for inviting me to this very important session, which is very close to my heart. I think it is very difficult to generalize that every political leadership is committed to this, conservation, mainly on the issue of nature and sustainable environmental management and development. So, but you see that one of the best examples we can see is the African leadership has taken the agenda of climate change, and for the first time in the history of the African Union, we were able to speak with one voice to present the African cause to the global community in terms of climate change, and working very hard with the global community to, help they understand that Africa, while contributing the most hard continent, the most affected continent is Africa. So I think we have tried our best collectively, working with African Development Bank and as well as the Economic Commission for Africa, on bringing about, logical and convincing rationale to the global community with regard to climate change and Africa's position. So that shows that there is a growing understanding that African leadership should come together for protecting our nature. I am very happy to hear yesterday in our gala dinner when the president of WCCF said that it's not, we shouldn't worry about the planet, we should worry about us, because it's we who are being hurt so much as human beings when we destroy our environment. So I think there is a growing understanding in Africa. Besides countries like Ethiopia, Rwanda, we have clearly spelled out our responsibility as responsible global citizens, even though we are not contributing too much to the global climate change issues and the greenhouse gas emission, but we have to show the global communities that if we, developing countries, can do something, then those developed countries has to do much more, because they are the ones who are, emitting the greenhouse gas. One of it is Ethiopia has designed in 2012 a climate resilient green growth policy and strategy. And these are 3 pillars, which is, first of all, our agriculture as dominantly agrarian society, that agriculture should be climate smart. And what do we mean by climate smart agriculture? I think we can enumerate a number of things, but for now, I think we took this as one of the responsibilities we have to do. Second, as latecomers, we have to use latecomers' advantage by producing our energy sources from renewables and clean and green energy. And the third one, which I just wanted to mention, is, people were talking yesterday also, that we need to reduce the loss of nature by having a very rigorous natural resource management. In this regard, Ethiopia has a very good example that can be emulated by many African countries. We have a huge afforestation program going on at this moment, and every year our citizens were mobilized and understand very well, the use of these forests and the benefit of these forests. And we were able to plant every year nearly 4 billion seedlings of forests in Ethiopia, every rainy season. So I think we also this rainy season, we were able to achieve global record by planting 312 million seedlings in one day. So I think this is an important, issues that shows our people has begun to understand, especially our young people has begun to understand the benefit of this. We do this in our climate resilient green growth strategy to show, not only that planting, but to get benefit out of it through what Hassan was saying, the red issue. I think this helps us to do so. We started carbon trading. Of course, it has not gone as we wished it to go. Communities has benefited a lot. Something which is very much worrisome now is we neglect our people, our communities, while we are doing conservation works. And people started to look into our protected areas as something which has come as a burden upon them, rather than something which helps them, and that has to be observed. So I think this strategy, climate resilient green growth strategy Ethiopia has set for itself, is moving in the right direction, including renewable energies. 95% of Ethiopia's energy comes from renewable energy sources. And we have a vision to have zero net carbon emission in Ethiopia by 2025. We are very sure that we can achieve this with the movement we are making now. So I think there is a policy and understanding by the leadership, African leadership, improving from time to time, but we are not up to the challenge of loss of nature as well as the climate change.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Minister Burita, in 1994, this nation obviously suffered a major catastrophe with the genocide. When the new government came in, you can imagine in such a situation, such a tragic situation, that there would have been so many priorities that the government had to tackle at the time. With all these competing priorities, why did Rwanda look at
as a country, we understood that environment protection and development were not two incompatible concepts. We understood that we needed to rehabilitate all the sectors of this country, but environment was one of these sectors which needed to be rehabilitated. And actually, we made some mistakes in the process because of these many priorities. And one of these mistakes was that a part of our Gishwati forest was used to resettle people. Returnees needed to be resettled, and we used part of that forest. It was destroyed. And as a consequences, we had floods, we had landslides, and we went back and relocated those people again. Gishwati forest was restored. And today we are proud that it has been declared the 4th national park. And the same applied for this volcano park. We understood that these gorillas had suffered from the conflict we went through from the 1990 to 1994. But with the peace being restored, we understood very well that tourism was one of these important sectors which need to be also looked at. And we took those decisions to protect the national park, or the Volcano National Park, and to put in place mechanism to involve the communities to be part of these efforts. And the results were that the gorillas came back, and today the population is growing. And the most important thing is that the local communities are involved in these efforts, and they're benefiting from the national park itself. 10% of the revenue from the national parks is going to the local population, and we have established this special guarantee fund to compensate. The Prime Minister has referred to that special guarantee fund, which was established to compensate the people whose crops were destroyed by the animals from the parks. These combinations of policies have seen our conservation efforts bring benefit to the population. And today, we are happy that the population understands well when the government is taking measures such as establishing a 4th national park in a country as small as Rwanda, and where priorities are very many, from agriculture to settlement, and so on and so forth. So from the beginning, we understood that environment protection and development were compatible, and we made sure that the population understand this very well, and that the population can also benefit directly from the effort of environment protection and conservation.
Thank you very much, Minister. So clearly, the government understood that nature could actually be used as a source, a pillar of growth, not a casualty. And it was a holistic strategy that you brought together over the last year. It's very inspiring to see what is happening here. And I'd like to go to you, Helen. So Helen, you were, before your role now with Flora and Fauna International, you were on the board of the Kenya Wildlife Service, if I understand correctly, and you were the president of the African Wildlife Foundation. And yesterday she shared that when she went into conservation, her family thought that she was crazy, and that she should have done other things. But we're glad that you stuck with it. So Helen, Kenya is obviously a country that has huge dependence on nature for its economy. Could you share a bit about how big is this economy to Kenya? If you were to quantify in terms of the size of that contribution to GDP and number of jobs and so forth, anything that you could share with us to give us a sense of just how significant is this to Kenya? And if you were to become the president of Kenya, I'm not saying that you should go into politics or anything, but if you were the president of Kenya, or had another very important position in government, what would you do? What specific changes would you make to actually double how much Kenya is making from what it has? What would you do? Share with us your most radical thinking, please.
Thank you, Fred. I think fortunately, if I was to become president, I would be given quite a lot more time to think about the question you just posed. And as I sit with this very distinguished panel, I am listening to some of the things that the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia is talking about, some of the things they've done, the Minister of Environment in Rwanda. But the question you pose is actually a really important one for Kenya, because Kenya is known as one of the premier or strong wildlife and tourism destinations on the continent. And tourism has been the third largest income earner in the country. One of the ones that, because of the nature of the tourism business, has contributed not just directly to the jobs within the tourism sector itself, but I think to a lot of the linkages in business that, in agriculture, supplying food, the whole of the tourism supply chain is one of the largest in the country, and it has impact and affects the economy through very many different channels and very many different connections. I don't have the data right now on the actual contribution, but it's the third largest at the moment. But what has been, I think, a challenge for Kenya, and this is some of what I dealt with as the president when I was doing my work with the African Wildlife Foundation, is looking at how tourism and wildlife, I think, one, can be better joined together, so that, and it always seems something difficult for people to understand that although Kenya is such a strong wildlife destination and a tourism destination, that often there's a disconnect between tourism and wildlife, and that tourism takes but does not feed sufficiently the wildlife sector, which is the one that drives it. And when we look at the tourism sector, how it's grown and how it's evolved in the country, I would say as a country, we have not done enough. We are not doing enough just yet. The biggest challenge, I would say, for tourism, and there are a few tourism operators here and owners of businesses, and some of them I've been talking to have said, what are some of the reasons that Kenya's tourism is struggling? The numbers sound large, but actually we're struggling. And they give a couple reasons, and these are some of the things that if I was in a position to change things, I would want to help implement. I think number one, we have not done well in the way we have priced and the way we are pricing our tourism product. If you look at tourism in Kenya over the last 30 years, it hasn't changed much. We haven't innovated. During the development of our Vision 2030, we talked about premium tourism. We talked about premium tourism destinations. We didn't do enough to actually capture the premium. And Rwanda has done really well to take its mountain gorillas and say these are premium product, and it's going to be the driver of tourism growth in the country. We have Masai Mara, a declared wonder of the world. We treat it exactly the same as other national parks. And yet there is willingness to pay there. So I think we need to innovate in the way we price. We need to season pricing. We need to differentiate. We need to differentiate our products. We need to price better. We need to create premium products. And in fact, we need to segregate our tourism market so that we are targeting our market, I think, in a better way. And I think those are some of the low-hanging fruit that we can do that would really change tourism. The second thing, I think, is that we haven't done much to change product Kenya. There is the marketing for Kenya as a destination. But again, when you talk to the people who are in the industry, they're saying, we've really done a poor job. We're marketing Kenya poorly. The story of Kenya is being told the same way it was told very many years ago. And as a result, it means we're not exciting people. We're not renewing the industry. We were described a few years ago by the World Bank, a World Bank report that said that we were a tired destination. We were a destination that has not renewed itself. So we haven't done much to change that. And actually, after such an indictment, you would have expected that we would rise up and we would do something about it. We haven't done anything about it. And I think that is one of the things that I think needs to change, is we need to renew the destination. We need to change it. We need to plan it differently. We need to market it differently. We need to price it. And it's really important. On the matter of Kenya Wildlife Service, I think as a part of, as an entity that can help as part of the growth sector within the industry, and as a principal entity that is charged with conservation in the country, again, it has struggled. And part of it, of the struggle in Kenya in tourism, I would say, and also with wildlife conservation, there is a political question. And every time we go through our 5-year election cycles, our tourism struggles, our wildlife agency struggles, because we are reliant on that money for economic development. And so we go through these 5 years of cycles of decline and growth. And when Kenya Wildlife Service struggles, the rest of the country struggles. What do we need to do about Kenya Wildlife Service, and what would I do that I think would help contribute to growth? I think Kenya Wildlife Service needs to be broken up. It needs to be simplified. Its mandate needs to be much more focused to protected areas. Kenya has a new law on conservancies, which has grown and has helped to, has caught on with conservancies that started earlier, before the law was made, but the law has caught on. And out of that, we've got just a new potential for communities and individuals outside of protected areas to actually take on conservation and tourism much more strongly. So I would simplify the role of Kenya Wildlife Service. I'd focus it on parks. I would remove the research agenda. We would remove the regulatory agenda, put that somewhere else so that somebody else is regulating what's happening outside protected areas, both in tourism and wildlife conservation. I would put certain protected areas under private partnerships, public-private partnerships, as Rwanda has done with Africa Parks, because I think that will help reduce the burden of it has 26 national parks that it's trying to conserve using tourism-generated revenues. It is not possible because they don't, only 10, I would say only 5 generate income. So you do need to find a way to bring new investments and new ideas into the conservation sector. And then I think a few of the other things that I would do to raise and increase revenue, I think we need to look at our climate funds. Hassan talked about that. We've already some projects that are doing carbon credit funds, taking them back to communities. I would look at land use. If I may briefly tell you a little bit about a challenge of Kenya, and that has played out because of our land use and land planning issues. As a country, with Tanzania, with countries like Botswana, we We have very open systems, large systems in which wildlife moves because of our rainfall patterns. That's why you have the Serengeti movement to the wildlife to the Mara. You have elephants that move, hundreds of kilometers into areas that are outside national parks. And we are losing ground quite quickly. We've lost, I would say, 6 to 7% of wildlife outside parks. And that is because we haven't, as a country, taken the leadership and the courage to plan and to define the areas that are really priority for conservation to survive into the future in Kenya. We've left those to private landowners, to community landowners. And as a country, we haven't done any spatial planning. And as a result, we're losing space. And wildlife conservation is about space. If you don't have space, it doesn't matter that you have wildlife. Eventually, it will disappear because you need the resources, you need the food, you need the water, and you need the space, certainly within our country, for animals to find food. So I would undertake spatial planning because I think, one, we can embed and we can prioritize the areas that are really essential for the survival of Kenya's conservation and therefore tourism industry. The second thing I would do is make sure that in doing that land use zoning, it is not done in ways that disadvantage those who own land in those areas, but that we would twin it with conservation, economic incentives, economic mechanisms that would help to ensure that there are revenue flows and there is economic activity in these areas. We would look at ways to crowd in investments in these areas so that we're not just reliant on tourism, but that we can do, I think, more. We would look at a lot of the other possibilities within the conservation. We've focused a lot on tourism, but I think there are new financing mechanisms, there are new investment opportunities outside of tourism. But I think the zonation of those lands, what it would do is it would reduce the loss of land to speculation. We're a country of land speculation. It would reduce the loss of land to agriculture conversion. We're losing a lot of land and fragmenting a lot of our land to agriculture. And then I would say, finally, it would give confidence to those who are investing in community areas because it would provide for longevity in the types of contracts and the types of relationships that we build. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. Maybe you should run for president of Kenya, don't you think? We would have better conservation outcomes. But thank you very much. Very comprehensive summary of ideas of how we could very practically enhance the value of conservation to Kenya. You talked about, thinking about the pricing. You talked about rebranding Kenya, especially in sort of updating its brand, which maybe is a bit out of date. And I agree. I think that's a big opportunity for the whole continent to actually brand itself better, and countries to really invest in marketing themselves. And you talked about some very specific policies as well about land use management and breaking up the Kenya Wildlife Service and creating more decentralized management of sites. And so I think some very, very practical suggestions which any of you who are thinking about ideas to take back to your own countries. Hopefully you picked up some great suggestions from Helen, and if I was Kenyan, you would definitely have my vote. Paulo, you were presidential candidate in I believe the last election in your country, in Guinea-Bissau. Most people here, when they think about conservation and tourism or wildlife economy, don't think of your country as one of the hotspots. So I'd love to hear from you. When you ran for president, was conservation on your agenda? And can you just talk a bit about sort of why it matters to Guinea-Bissau?
Yeah, thank you, Fred. I think how many of you have heard about Guinea-Bissau prior to this conference? How many of you have heard about Amilcar Cabral prior to this conference? So I think to understand my country, you have to first look at its history. And Amilcar Cabral, which is one of I would say the founding father of the thinking of independence of Africa. But he was also very strategic because the way he built the theory on the independence and the fight for independence. He managed to combine politics, obviously, because it was about how to get the country independent, but he also loaded the theory and the narrative with culture. Because for him, our struggle was also a cultural process. And obviously linked that also with the issue of mindset. And I think with everything that I heard since yesterday on this very innovative conference, is that in addressing our issue of conservation in many of our countries, we need obviously to look at money, business model, but also to look at mindset and culture. Those things are very important when you plug them into policy change, because it doesn't require money. And I have been very privileged to deal with Rwanda. I was at the World Bank for many years, and since '98 I worked with Rwanda and many of our friends. And if you look at the success of Rwanda as a model, it's not just an issue of policy and money. It's also the incredible mindset and the way the mindset issue has been used to drive the change. So on Guinea-Bissau, it's important to say that we have a very bad reputation. It hasn't been that way for many years. But our reputation is not good now, because when people think about Guinea-Bissau, they think about drug trafficking as being one of the platforms in the Atlantic coast of West Africa in terms of transit of drugs. And the issue here is not to say that we are not the main country of transit of drug. That's not the issue here. I think it would be like, I think someone was saying, when you compete with someone, a dwarf compete with another dwarf to say that I'm taller than you. The issue for Guinea-Bissau is not to say that we are the country, other countries do drugs or traffic of drugs. We have that issue, and that issue is penalizing our reputation and also our attractiveness. But the formidable thing that we have managed to do, despite our instability, coup d'etat, conflicts, is that the country in the last 30 years has created a critical mass of people very committed in terms of conservation. The country is the size of Rwanda, more or less, a little bit bigger, but 26%, 25% of our country is protected area, 25. It's almost like if you combine Seychelles and Galapagos and you plug it into the Atlantic coast. We have 88 islands. Only 20 of those 88 islands are inhabited. The rest are completely empty. We have unique species in that archipelago. So as I was saying, 25% of our country is protected area. 10% of our country is mangrove. So this morning, I think the CEO of Conservation International was talking about the way we could leverage mangrove for carbon credit. So those 10% are well protected, and we are trying to innovate in terms of using that to raise funds to finance the protected area. Because once you have 25% of your country as a protected area, the issue now, the challenge is to have the money to be able to create opportunities, economic opportunity, and address the need of the population. So as a candidate a few years ago, when I ran for president as an independent and I came third, I said to myself, obviously the objective is to win the election, but I think I can go further. And what we did is that we have gathered all the candidates, there were 13 candidates, into a closed room for a discussion with the staff. In a closed discussion. We didn't put the media, so we'll create or at least boost the egos of many of the candidates. And we managed to have a discussion about the issue of climate change and conservation. We came up with some ideas, and those ideas were plugged into a national strategy, and there's a consensus in terms of that. The issue for us now, and what I will welcome, is since this conference is taking place in a country that has managed successfully to move into conservation, is to look for an opportunity to have a discussion in an environment less sexy, because Guinea-Bissau is much less sexy. The reputation is not the one you have here in Rwanda, but for which I think, as I said initially, you had a critical mass of leaders who have managed to engage in terms of conservation and successfully moving, although I think we need to plug much more resources, much more flexible, intelligent business model to make money with that conservation and be able to make it sustainable.
Thank you very much. So maybe it's time to go and invest in Guinea-Bissau if you're looking at some new opportunities there in the islands. So we're running out of time, and so maybe if I can just ask for just 1 minute responses in the last question I'm going to ask all of you, and I'll give each person a separate question. Prime Minister Hailemariam, since you left office, your foundation has been focusing quite a bit on conservation. Ethiopia isn't necessarily known as a country that has, it's not known as a wildlife hotspot. So maybe in just 1 minute, please, if you could just share why should Ethiopia be taken more seriously, and what are some of the exciting opportunities in this sector for Ethiopia?
Fred, I think in 1 minute it's very difficult to express my views, and I hope one more minute can be added. First of all, my country is an ancient country with, history goes 5 millennia, and a country with huge diversity. In the last of my 2 years in office, I try to bring about, conservation-based tourism and climate-smart and ecotourism into a policy, and we wanted to implement those things. Myself, I came to understand my country very well in the last 2 years when I engaged myself in this process. Many people do not understand what Ethiopia is and how its diversity is. So I said, this is an area where I should come up and say to the global community that my country is very unique, and everybody should understand and come and visit and see, but conservation as one of the pillars in this country. 10% of the land mass is protected, but there is a declining, species declining. We have 7 unique endemic mammals, bigger ones, in the country, and I think they are now in extinction. We have to save all those things very well. But above all, in all these protected areas, when I was in office, we were thinking that if we build schools, health centers, water points, and other communal facilities, we think that people will be happy, so that they will go for conservation and keeping the wildlife safe. But I came to understand with my little survey that this is not the case. These kind of projects will give the people a temporary satisfaction, but if you don't make proper livelihood issues to the community and bring those livelihood that brings money to their pockets and that helps them to expand in their own life, I think it won't be sustainable. So I said, I like this conference because it talks about business and investment, environmental investment, but can we make the community to be partnering in this investment? Can we make them, investing together? Can we make them managing together with us? And ultimately, can we make them own the whole process? I think this is a big question that comes to my mind every time. So I came to learn from this conference, how can we make the community at the center of all this agenda? Otherwise, I think our exercises, whatever NGO or governments do, ultimately it doesn't make sustainable conservation. The word conservation, when you translate into Amharic, it's not so much a good word. I mean, it doesn't explain what all is about. So I think we have to find a new meaning for this thing. I mean, a new word. I don't know. I don't understand
we want to call
English
it
very
environmental
well.
investing. So maybe we can find
but
an Amharic
even
word
it's
for
worse when you translate into African languages. So I think we have to be very careful in dealing with these kind of things. But the whole thing is, you know, from many competing, you know, interests and areas where, you know, many boards are now asking me to be part of their board and many places to come. But finally I said something which is deep and closer to my heart is conservation-based tourism, where we can create huge job. And my country is the second populace with 106 million population, and it's also a big country in the landmass. But this huge opportunity is in front of us. By making community at the center of this process, we can make jobs to our young people, which is very important in our continent. So I then have chosen this to be my major engagement in the next phase of my life. So that's why my foundation focuses on this part.
Thank you very much, Excellency. And for those of you who don't know, Ethiopia has, I believe, the second largest migration. Everyone knows about the migration of the wildebeest and the Masai Mara and Serengeti, but Ethiopia has actually the second largest migration in the world. And a huge untapped tourist opportunity. And so the challenge is to all of you. In closing, please, Minister Biruta, one piece of advice that you would give to people who want to engage their governments to get more support for conservation in their countries. How should they be approaching it? One short piece of advice.
Yes, I will say that first of all, government needs to have the right policies in place and to allow these, to allow a conducive environment for investment in conservation. And we need to understand that benefits from conservation go well beyond the dollars we are earning from tourists. But conservation is contributing to the well-being of the people in terms of air quality, in terms of water purification, and investment in conservation is worth it because it is contributing also to climate resilience. And when you invest in conservation, it means you are also contributing to the goals we have set in the Paris Agreement in terms of climate change. So just as government, let's make sure we put in place the right policies to create that environment which is needed for investment and make conservation a priority. And we know that we can earn money from that sector, but also contribute to climate resilience and to the general well-being of the population. Thank you.
Thank you. Paulo, if folks wanted to come into Guinea-Bissau, can you share what you think would be the sort of the lowest hanging fruit in terms of investment that would really catalyze the wildlife economy in your country?
Investment?
If folks wanted to come and invest in Guinea-Bissau, what would you see as the lowest hanging fruit that would have the biggest bang for the buck in terms of catalyzing the wildlife economy there?
I think since there is a sense of urgency in the country now, and that's very important in terms of creating the enabling environment. Because of that, I will see as a low-hanging fruit to interact with a set of people who are not just in the administration, because as we say, the leadership is important, but I say there is a critical mass of people in several organizations who have been engaged on this business of conservation with the protected area, the 25% I have mentioned, and which a focus certainly on helping those areas to be assessed in terms of assets. we talked about next year being an important year, 2020. I want to stress that Africa has played its role as far as 2020 is concerned. We have more asset than liability. After the Paris conference, Africa has agreed to comply or to drive the agenda on climate change and biodiversity. The issue now is to put a real value on these assets that Africa has now. And I don't think that the classical GDP measurement that the economists have used so far to assess our assets as African has been fair. So I think here is to jump into research, work to assess the value of those assets, and you will quickly see that this is an enormous opportunity. Obviously, Guinea-Bissau still a country that has potential on tourism. As I said, our country is a combination of Seychelles with Galapagos. So if you want to have the equivalent, for example, on the gorilla is our hippopotamus, for example. We have the unique species of hippopotamus in the world. They are from salty water, and they are unique. So you could create an entire ecosystem of business around that hippo, as Rwanda shows us how to do it with gorilla. And secondly, if you pull out Guinea-Bissau from West Africa, basically the whole West Africa coast will disappear. The industry, the fishery industry will disappear. Because Guinea-Bissau is the breeding ground, Mauritania in some extent. But Guinea-Bissau is really the place where the ecosystem of fishery is being, is emerging. Which means that you have opportunity for fishery sector, but not the way it has been done in terms of pirates coming and taking all the fish, but in something much more boutique in terms of fishery business that can be served. And because now we have the Africa Trade Agreement that has been pushed by Rwanda and other countries, there's opportunities to develop fishing sector for other markets. Guinea-Bissau is just 1.6 million people. So as a country, we are very small. But if you think in terms of selling fish to other countries, the neighboring countries, such as Nigeria, Ghana, and not only about thinking about selling fish to Europe, just in the region, and I think the Continental Trade Agreement will help show people that you have market in the region, and you shouldn't be only focused on selling to Europe or Asia, because the market, at least as fish is concerned, is quite big in West Africa. So those will be the low-hanging fruit that I would like to stress and present and to put on the table for people who are looking for investment in the medium and long run.
Great, thank you. Maybe you should have been in Leopard's Cove yesterday. Helen, final thing, very briefly, please. What do you think this community could do to make or to bring the potential for the wildlife economy more to the forefront for African politicians, African political leaders, let's put it that way?
Well, what I would say is that always I think the decisions politicians have to make between the trade-offs they have to make for their countries in terms of short-term trade-offs versus long-term trade-offs. I think ultimately, drive some of the decisions that we see that even with the best intentions to conserve sometimes undermine the environment. And I think André talked about it today, not just with governments, but I think also with companies. I think there's also a sense in which we have not prioritized environment. We've not brought it to the highest level. Some countries have done it well. Others have not done it. And I think some of what this community could do, I think one is, is help to bring the information much more closely to our governments, to our policymakers. I think on the value of nature, we've talked about valuation of nature and looking at many of the benefits that it provides and making them clear and sometimes almost trying to give them dollar terms. What's the value of forest for carbon? What is the value of forest for water? We cannot live without water. If you look at the country, we have destroyed a lot of our forests, and it's been great to hear and talk to the former Prime Minister about some of the recovery work they're doing in their country to bring back forests. But the dependency on forests and water and a lot of the ecosystem services it provide is huge. But we don't tend to think about those other values. We tend to think about the tree. We tend to think about the land, so we allow agriculture into those forests. We cut trees for charcoal, for wood, for timber, because that is immediate money. So I think what we can do is find a way to bring this information in ways that are much more easily understood at the policy level, that where we can create and connect and put it in language that is clear and understandable, valuing nature, valuing the economic base it can provide, the incomes from it, but also our future reliance and dependability on it. So a lot of the people here are dealing with it from either from a business perspective, from a policy perspective, or from a conservation perspective. And I think if we all could work towards messaging and towards bringing information in ways that is consumable, in ways that enlighten, in ways that show the value unequivocally, I think we'll do well. Governments are trying, but I think there is not always enough on the information, but also the trade-offs front to help make decisions that secure conservation and secure it strongly.
Thank you very much. Excellent. I mean, that's, so you're talking about building a fact base to really enable policymakers to be able to make the decisions and understand the economic value. Actually, on that regard, one of the things that I'm excited to share is that here at the ALU School of Wildlife Conservation, we are about to launch a research project to actually size the wildlife economy, to really look and say across the whole continent how much of our GDP is actually coming from this sector, and what could it be, and what are the gaps that are preventing us from getting there, and how many jobs are created from it, how much tax is paid, and so that we can actually then share this information and to be able to educate policymakers around that. So we hope to share some of the early findings from that at next year's BCC, but really we want to become a custodian for that knowledge base, so that we can actually be speaking for much more fact-based right now, and I think ultimately that's the language that political leaders need to understand, because as Vera shared yesterday, we have this massive youth bulge. People need jobs on the continent, and if we can have this fact base, we can then hopefully have tools to be able to engage political leaders. So that's something that we're going to be doing to support that. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, panelists, for your time. And as always, we could have had a lot more time to talk, but we have to move on to other things on the agenda. So thank you again, and look forward to further engagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred, and thank you so much to all the panelists. I must say I'm really impressed with the diversity we have here. We have 4 different African countries represented in this conversation, and it's just outstanding. At this moment, could you please all stand as we see the Honorable Prime Minister out? Thank you so much for joining us. And next up, on our sessions, we're going to move down to MH 1 and 2, which is downstairs. Now we'd like to change things up and make you experience what it feels like to be in the shoes of a policymaker. It's easy to talk about certain policies that we could implement, but now you'll get a sense of what would it actually feel like to be involved in making these policies. So the ushers will lead you down this way into MH1 and 2. You'll also find refreshments down there. So yes, please enjoy, and I'll see you in the next section. Thank you.